Our next panel is the road to a decade of mega sports events in the United States. So once again, we have a great group of speakers who will be here to join us. That includes our moderator, Travis Parker, who is the Officer for Cultural Affairs and Sport at the EU Delegation. Dan Mickelson, the Sports Diplomacy Chief at the Department of State. Katherine DeStefano, Associate General Counsel at the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. And Alex Sopko, Director of Government Relations and Public Engagement for FIFA World Cup 2026. So if you could please welcome them to the stage, we'll go ahead and get started.
All right. We good mic-wise? Tap it once so it turns green, we're on. Hi, everybody. Allow me to give you, I believe, your fourth welcome of the day. Welcome to Panel 3, A Road to a Mega Decade of Sporting Events here in the United States. As Devin introduced, my name's Travis Parker. I have the honor to share the stage with these three esteemed folks who are more than equipped to talk about what's coming in America this next 10 years, kind of what's already started, in all honesty, in America this next 10 years. Just a brief rundown. Travis outlined it in the welcome remarks today, but the next 10 years in America is going to have the global spotlight essentially shining on this country. We've got the FIFA Club World Cup in 2025. 2026 is going to see the Men's World Cup, World Baseball Classic. 2028, of course, the LA Paralympic and Olympic Games. There's going to be another Olympic Games at the end of this decade in 2034. We've got a Rugby World Cup somewhere in between. I'm skipping over a handful of events just to give you an idea of all that's coming. Also, this decade has kind of already started. The Solheim Cup just took place here in the DMV. We had the Gold Cup, Copa America. I'm already skipping over a handful of other things. And there will be other global sporting events taking place during this decade as well that the U.S. is competing in. Shout out to our host, Spain, for co-hosting the 2030 Men's World Cup with Morocco and Portugal. And so while we are discussing kind of the global spotlight in this panel, our focus is going to be on the United States, is going to be on the American perspective of organizing and hosting these mega events. And Dan, I'm going to turn to you first because sports diplomacy, written into the title of this conference, is also written into the title of your job description, of your title. Sports diplomacy at its most basic is when an entity, be that a country, a city, a person, leverages sport to promote their brand, their image, their values. You represent sport diplomacy from the American perspective, from the State Department. You are the chief of sport diplomacy. How is your office approaching this decade? What's your hosting strategy toward the next 10 years?
That's a great question. How much time do we have?
You have 30 minutes to be divided among many other questions.
First, let me say thanks to Jetr and the Spanish Embassy for putting on this event, the first of what I hope is many sports diplomacy conferences and gatherings here in Washington and really coast to coast as we try to make this mega decade something for all Americans. So what we're thinking right now with our hosting strategy starts with knowing that this mega decade is the greatest public diplomacy opportunity of our generation. Sports rises above the fray. Sports has this amazing convening power. So how can we use it to showcase our American values to the world? And we don't just get one bite at the apple. And as Travis said, the mega decade has already started. I think we need to add the Cricket World Cup that happened this past summer.
I knew I skipped one.
There's a couple, but we'll get into them. So how are we showcasing our American values? How are we talking about disability rights and highlighting the Americans with Disabilities Act? How are we talking about equal pay, the movement championed by so many, but highlighted by the U.S. women's soccer team, and the Equal Pay for Team USA Act that President Biden signed last year? And then how are we talking about gender equality as one of our American values, and talking about Title IX? So these are some of the things that we want to highlight throughout the decade, the mega decade, as part of our hosting strategy. The last thing I'll add, if I can, is that no one wants the U.S. government coming in and saying, listen to me, we know how to do it. We're stronger when we have partners. And so we've already begun the process. It started long before I came and will continue of looking for partners in this space. And the whole decade, and really public diplomacy going forward, is all about partnerships. So that's broadly what we're thinking right now.
There are a long list, as Dan just mentioned, of mega events that I've either skipped over, omitted, forgotten, repeated twice, et cetera, but there's two really big ones in everyone's psyche when they think about this upcoming decade, and they are the Olympics and Paralympics. We have two iterations of them, one in Salt Lake City at the end of the decade, obviously one in Los Angeles in 2028, and the Men's World Cup, which hasn't been here for a long, long time. Katherine, you represent the Olympic and Paralympic Committee. There's a lot that has been learned from Paris, which has been seen as one of the kind of more recent global sporting events that passes the baton, or the torch, if you will, to the United States to essentially launch this global decade. But also, Paris brought forth a handful of different new ways to approach hosting the Olympics and Paralympics. What has your office learned from the Paris Games, and how does the U.S. hope to take this forward with LA and maybe Salt Lake?
Yeah, thanks, Travis. And you're exactly right. There is a literal passing of the torch. You saw it at closing ceremony from Paris over to LA. I think there are a few key takeaways. There was a lot, but I'll highlight just a few from the Paris Games going into LA. One, it was a very sustainable games, right? We think about the environment, we think about climate. Paris really led the way with the way that they conducted the games. It was the first games where there were no physical tickets, all were digital, which is kind of mind-blowing that we're in 2024, and the Olympic and Paralympic movement is just now kind of latching onto that trend. So I think you'll see sustainability. We also see, we saw with Paris, just the location and the types of venues they used, right? A lot, you've probably all heard or read articles about venues that go to waste, essentially, after an Olympic and Paralympic Games happen. Paris used current infrastructure, and then for anything that they didn't have current infrastructure for, they were temporary venues, meaning that they would go away after the games. And I think that was something like 95% of the venues. What you'll see in LA, or what they're promising, is 100% of the venues. So you'll have the Coliseum, Crypto Arena, the LA Convention Center, already standing infrastructure, and then anything else that needs to be created will be temporary venues. One, it's a more economical way of doing things, but also it allows the local community to thrive, and you'll see a lot of culture and arts, which Paris really amplified. You probably saw NBC's coverage of that. That will be the same in LA. And then the last thing I'll highlight is it just escaped me. Give me 1 second.
While you think about that, for those who looked at the Paris Games from an environmental standpoint, you're talking about reusing structures. Paris did this beautifully, whether it's horse riding and equestrian competitions through Palace of Versailles, fencing in the Grand Palais de Concorde. It was one of those, okay, we are going to raise the bar to here. For 95% of structures are going to be sustainable from a reusable standpoint. And LA is saying, we see your bar and we would like to bring it up even a little bit more, right?
That's right, and thank you for prodding me, because the last thing I wanted to highlight was the Olympic Village, right? The Olympic and Paralympic Village. That is now turned into, the whole premise for Paris was to turn that into affordable housing post-games. So come November, next month, people will move in and that will be their home. It'll be an apartment complex, there were parks, and I think you'll also see something similar with LA.
And sport diplomacy kind of encapsulates all of this. It's not just, hey, welcome to our country, here's what you think of, America. France, when you look at the past Olympic Games, you think of Paris tourism brochures almost. It's just a little bit of subtle marketing and then also repurposing into affordable housing, something that can be taken forward and that people, whether they're ticket holders or whether they are participants in these Olympic and Paralympic Games, can remember this by. It's a legacy of sport diplomacy that the United States is uniquely poised to take forward through that and through, might I say, the 2026 World Cup and the 2025 FIFA Club World Cup as well. The second of these huge events taking place in this decade of huge events. So, Alex, you represent FIFA World Cup 2026. This is going to be a different World Cup. obviously we think about nations playing each other, qualifying group stages, et cetera, et cetera. That's kind of there, but can you give us a bit of a breakdown on the unique attributes that are coming in 2026 and maybe what you're looking for?
Yes, and I'm so glad you brought up 2025 Club World Cup, because I think we just 2 weeks ago announced the cities that are going to be hosting the 2025 Club World Cup. So just so folks know, we have in June and July next year, June, July, August next year, fans coming from around the world from the 32 club teams who will be playing 63 matches in the U.S. It's the first time that Club World Cup has existed. Not just those host cities, though, will see the benefit. We also have a number of cities that are going to be base camp cities for our teams. We have a number of locations where we expect fans to travel to. It's going to be massive. I mean, Travis, you know club fans very well. This is huge for the U.S. It's huge around the world, and so we're very excited for it to be coming to the U.S. And of course, the year after, we have the 2026 World Cup. We have 48 national teams. We have 104 matches. This is the largest World Cup ever, but this is also the largest footprint ever. It's 3 countries hosting. First time that it's 3 countries hosting, US, Canada, and Mexico. It's 16 cities across those 3 countries, not to mention, again, 40 base camp cities. We have a number of cities that are going to get excited as well. Washington, D.C. hosting the Club World Cup. Washington, D.C. celebrating the World Cup in 2026. So just footprint-wise, this is the largest footprint of a sporting event ever. It is massive, which means there's a massive range of possibility and opportunity, like Dan was talking about. So whether that's the work that our host cities are doing on legacy and sustainability, just like Paris 2024 and like LA 28, we're using pre-existing infrastructure. I know Brendan from NFL was just on for World Cup. It's all NFL stadiums. Or whether it's the work that we're going to be doing with embassies as we get into the draw and then into the planning for Club World Cup. Whether it's the work that our business community and travel and tourism are focusing on how do we get folks to be excited to come to the U.S. And we have 3 billion folks who will tune into the final of the World Cup, not to mention the billions that will be watching the 103 games going into it. And so to put in perspective, you mentioned that it's been a while since the U.S. has hosted a massive sporting event. Last Men's World Cup that was here was in 1994. That led to the creation of Major League Soccer. We are double the number of teams coming. We are double the number of matches coming. So it's just an incredible opportunity, and we're excited.
Soccer fever has decidedly taken America by storm since 1994, both men's and women's soccer. And we've seen viewership statistics just continue to rise on both sides of the Atlantic, whether you're watching European soccer, which I represent the European Union. We'd love it if you tuned into various games across the continent, or if you're watching men's and women's soccer here in the United States or throughout North and South America. Any exposure to the global game will get people extremely excited for both the FIFA Club World Cup next year and the Men's World Cup in 2026. I'm hearing some similarities between the Olympics of reusable stadiums, not building any new things. This is something that people are going to remember after America has hosted these mega events. Something that people are also going to remember, and looking ahead to the 2030 Men's World Cup, which is also a 3-host package, is that the United States worked with Mexico and Canada to pull this off. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what opportunities you see of hosting a World Cup, not just here in the States, not just on one side of the States, across the entirety of the United States and North America at large?
Yes, it is, as anyone who has done event planning before, logistically, both an exciting opportunity, but obviously a lot of challenges. You know, whether this is we're expecting 6 million international fans to come to the U.S. and also Canada and Mexico for the 2 stays in Canada, 3 stays in Mexico that will be hosting the World Cup. So whether it's on visas and how do we make sure that folks are able to come and to cheer on their team and to see everything that the U.S., Canada, and Mexico has to offer, whether it's getting goods and services across the borders, U.S., Canada, and Mexico on a very short turnaround. Our teams play, and then 2 days later they play again, and to make sure that everything they need to be at their best is coming across the border with them. Whether it's making sure that everyone knows, know before you go, practices, best ways of making sure that with travel they're able to get their flight, they're able to get their rental car, they're able to come across the border. There's a lot that we want to make sure we're working with our partners, working with embassies, state, and with our Canadian, Mexican governments to ensure that everyone has the information they need and is aware of what they need to do so that they can come to the US, come to Canada, come to Mexico, cheer on their teams. So if you are with an embassy, just know there will be a lot of outreach coming your way very soon. But we do want to make sure, because it is a three-country tournament, it's 3 hosts, that we are doing this in a coordinated manner, that we are working with all of our partners together, and that we're working with new partners who can help amplify, one, how exciting this will be, 2, how to make sure that they can attend, and then to make sure that they, while they're here, are having the best time that they can. And same for Canada and Mexico.
There's a decent amount of the diplomatic community here today, so feel free to come up and chat with Alex to be proactive in that communication if you'd like at some point after this panel. Otherwise, you might be hearing from her office at some point soon. Speaking of offices that are preparing for not just the World Cup, but this global decade at large, Dan, we just talked about kind of the opportunities of co-hosting, if you will, something like the World Cup. You are therefore preparing to welcome not just fans from Mexico and Canada, but welcome the world, I think is the phrase that you like to use. How is your office preparing for this kind of unique opportunity of not just the global spotlight shining upon the United States, but actually a bunch of people coming for tourism opportunities and obviously to see games?
So a couple of things. One, our office back at the State Department, our sports diplomacy team for years, 25, 30 plus years, and they can correct me on that number if I'm wrong, has run exchange programs that tie people together both overseas in the United States through sports. And that's the bread and butter of what we've done for the longest time. What we're doing ahead of the mega decade, and we started in June, I think it was, is we reactivated an old title that had not been fulfilled in the US government since 2001. So our team is now the State Department's coordinator for international athletics. It's much more than just programs. We see ourselves as the coordinator within the State Department and the executive branch, bringing people together, making sure that just at a basic level, we're coordinated about this stuff. We're talking. It's not just the State Department talking about public diplomacy. It's how can the Department of Interior, the Department of Commerce, HHS, we were at the Pentagon yesterday, just bringing it all together so we have the full resources of the US government swimming in the same direction, kicking in the same direction. I don't know what the phrase is for the Olympics and Paralympics, but making sure we're not missing an opportunity, and we can talk about some of those opportunities that we found in a second. The second thing that we're doing is our team is leading a working group out of the White House on community engagement and legacy, specifically looking at opportunities tied to public diplomacy so we can get our maximum effect from coast to coast and across the globe and highlight some of those, or really all of those American values that we choose to and that we want to. So what are we doing? Domestically, we're looking at the tourism piece inside of the United States with the Department of Commerce. We've stood up a tourism policy council on sports tourism. We're looking at opportunities for people, fans, that when they come to the United States, what else can we offer them? You talked about a travel and tourism pamphlet in Paris.
I did.
We've got 11 cities in the United States, but there are 11 host cities, but there's hundreds of other amazing cities that we want to highlight and offer up and make sure fans who might not get to go to a soccer game because there's only 5.8 million tickets? 6.5. 6.5? Oh, plenty. If you can't go to a game, you can't afford to go to a game, you can't get a ticket for whatever reason, you're still here enjoying the United States, seeing the vast cultural experiences that we have. You talked about LA, the culture capital of the United States. There's plenty of other awesome opportunities. So we're working with cities and states through this subcommittee to make sure they're aware of this and trying to activate them. Domestically, and I'm really excited to talk about this, and if anyone has money, we need money for it, we're gonna revitalize the Presidential Youth Fitness Program. So how many people did the V-sit and reach growing up? Yeah, or the wall hang? That's been an unfunded program that has not been really updated or activated since 2013.
You're talking about what you would do in PE classes in elementary and stuff?
Touch your toes, run a mile, all that stuff, and there's no adaptive component. So students with disabilities or athletes with disabilities don't have an opportunity to run a mile because there's nothing that they can do that's similar that allows for them to still compete. So HHS, this is an initiative they're leading. We're working with them. We're looking for money right now. Ideally, we do a soft launch in 2026 in our schools around the country, or some of them, maybe our host cities, and a sister city overseas, and then a full launch in 2028. But a lot of logistics in the way, but these are the type of things that the organization and the coordination has started to find, and what we're gonna do our best to make happen.
My goodness, I have so many memories of realizing that I could not do a pull-up when I was like...
That's why it was the wall hang. There was an option.
That was the other option. I was great at the wall hang.
I was a wall hanger too. I was not a pull-up guy. So.
Excellent. I knew I liked you. Katherine, so we talked about welcoming the world through Dan's eyes, which, you know, from the U.S. State Department perspective means preparing. Oh my goodness, what are you going to do from the mega level of, you know, just tourism to how are our airports going to function to how many tickets are there to what cities can we work with, all the way down to the lowest level, not lowest level, but maybe the least seen of what's happening in our elementary school gym classes. But welcoming the world also means welcoming fans. And welcoming fans from a variety of different backgrounds. And our first panel today talked about accessibility in sports across different, you know, economic backgrounds, across different genders, across different sport preferences. You have a unique perspective in watching essentially kind of how many people are interested in sports. I know that you're very proud of how many people tuned in to the Paris Summer Olympics and Paralympics. Can you talk a little bit more about what trends you have seen across these various demographics and maybe ways that we can continue to kind of build on this and keep seeing the viewership of men's and women's sports rise here in the United States, not just maybe in the Olympics, but throughout this decade as a whole?
Yeah, definitely. Fan engagement is a priority. So just before the Paris Games started, Team USA kicked off its One for All campaign. You probably may have seen some ad spots about it. NBC's viewership over the 17-day period of the Olympic Games alone was over 30 million viewers, which from Tokyo is like light years. Granted, like Tokyo, which we kind of labeled the pandemic games, was just a different kind of games. But you probably may also have noticed we can't leave out the fact, we talked about adaptive sport. We are one of the only national committees that operates and governs both Olympic and Paralympic sport. So NBC, for the first time with the Paris Games, I think had over 1,000 hours of coverage between Peacock, NBC, all of their other affiliates. And I think you're gonna see a lot more coverage of both able-bodied athletes and disabled athletes. And it's something that we love to see. It's something that we champion. And I think over this next decade, you're going to see a lot of that throughout the United States. I know that LA has that on their target list as well to highlight. And then the other thing I'll touch upon is two things: grassroots sports, right? So the local organizing committee for LA 28, that is imperative for them. They really want to hone in on their local community, and that's something we may not have always seen, but I think that it could transfer over to the 2024 games in Salt Lake. You know, they want youth and grassroots sports to grow. We love that because then we have our pipeline of our next Olympians and Paralympians and hopefuls. And then the last thing I'll touch on is just women's sports, right? I'd be derelict if I didn't mention that Team USA fielded the same amount of female athletes as women athletes in Paris. And women accounted for around 65% of Team USA's gold medals. So, you know, girl power. But yeah, it deserves a round of applause. And I think that trend is just, listen, we look at professional leagues, we look at the W, we look at, you know, professional volleyball leagues coming into this country. I think the trend for women's sports for the last probably 5 years, right? People have said the time is now, but like, no, really, like the time is now.
Yeah, earlier in this panel, the phrase was, it's not a moment in time, it's momentum that we are picking up on right now. Dan, you had one other thing to add to that.
Just the growth of youth sports and grassroots sports, if that's the phrase you used. The US government, HHS, has set this benchmark through their Healthy People 2030 initiative to increase youth sports participation to 63% by 2030. We're on the lower end of where we should be. We're at about 54%, so great goal to get up to 63% in the next 5 years. but it's going to take great partners like USOPC and others in the community actually doing stuff about it. And I've read a little bit about what you're doing with the Grassroots Initiative, and it's pretty fantastic.
Still have about 6 minutes until we turn to Q&A. So I want to ask this kind of open-ended question to all three of you. Alex, we'll start with you and we'll move down the panel. Go ahead 10 years. It's 2034. The Salt Lake Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games have wrapped up, therefore kind of concluding what we currently perceive to be this mega decade. Lord knows, there might be this could turn into a mega fortnight year. I don't know what that's called. Somewhere out there's a measurement of 14 years, 15 years, 20 years. But let's say 2034, Salt Lake has wrapped. What would you see in the rearview mirror as markers that this decade was a success from an American hosting perspective? Now, of course, you can speak from FIFA World Cup's perspective, the IOC perspective, and then Dan, maybe from kind of the wider perspective as well. Alex, I'll start with you. Whether you're talking about the Club World Cup or the Men's World Cup, maybe even the Women's World Cup if the bid is successful.
I'm going to say the biggest success is going to be if the decade doesn't end, if it just keeps going. You know, Dan's excited about that one. I think one of the biggest tools and biggest pieces is to make sure that we as the U.S. are seeing these sporting events for how massive they are. You know, for World Cup, for instance, we have economic impact numbers that will be coming out this fall, but when we did the bid process, we had economic impact numbers that showed up to $21 billion in economic impact to the U.S. That is massive. We know that LA 28 and Salt Lake City will see the same Rugby World Cup. We recognize we come first, and we know that all these sporting events and planning bodies are looking to see how the U.S. handles having a massive sporting event for the first time since 2002 with the last Salt Lake City Games. So I would like this decade to not end, and I know in order to do that, we do need to make sure that the U.S. is seeing these events as the massive impact that they have and can be, but also are starting to get processes in place so that, you know, we're not, after 2002, that muscle memory went away. And now we're working with U.S. government, Canada, and Mexico, because Canada last held a massive event with 2010 Vancouver. But how to make sure that in North America this muscle memory doesn't go away? There are processes in place, whether it's on visas and immigration, whether it's on customs, whether it's with just transportation and planning in general, so that we make it easier for events to keep coming to the U.S. because these already exist, and it's not having to not necessarily start from scratch, but have to rebuild a bit, whether it's on the legacy side or whether it's on more of the logistical pieces and processes.
So 10 years turns into 14 years, turns into 20 years, turns into a quarter century of mega sporting events.
Let's bring them all to the U.S. Also the growth of youth soccer, but...
Slip that one in there at the end.
Yep.
Second. Katherine, same question to you. If you are, you just wrapped up one of the biggest projects, certainly I would guess, on your portfolio, the Salt Lake Games. What would you see as having been an example or a marker of success that this decade went well from the American perspective?
A couple of things. Alex touched upon this idea of legacy, right? So the LA 84 games were one of the only profitable games ever. And what that means is there was a surplus left over, which was then turned into an endowment, and that endowment still funds our athletes today. So I think that's one piece we can't forget about profit and revenue, right? Like, it would be great if both of those games end in a surplus similar. I know that that's sort of eye on the prize for both LA and Salt Lake. And the second thing I'll touch on is just exposure to new sport, right? We think about soccer, we think about its growth in our country. We were sort of late adapters, but we have MLS, we have the NWSL. We see what the NFL is doing and going and playing in Brazil, Latin American countries, Europe. There will be 5 new sports introduced in LA, right? Lacrosse, flag football, baseball's coming back. I'm blanking on the other 2, but cricket, there we go. But those are more global sports that maybe the U.S. hasn't necessarily latched onto yet. So I think 10 years from now, if sort of that exposure and ability to wrap our heads around different sports that are huge in other parts of the world will just globally advance sport on a huge level.
You touched on baseball, and I do want to make sure that we spend a lot of time when we look at this decade talking about soccer, football, American football going abroad, the Olympics and Paralympics. There's a World Baseball Classic happening in 2026, probably another one in 2029. MLB is playing overseas as well. Maybe it's just because I'm a massive baseball fan, and Dan has specifically asked not to know the result of the Tigers game, so please
no
don't
one.
spoil
it's going
that
on
to
right
him.
now.
But growing sports like that are kind of written into the American bloodstream overseas is a huge thing that can come out of this decade from my perspective. Maybe it's because I'm an American who loves baseball and I want to see baseball grow in Europe, which is the governing body that I work for. For me, that's kind of my marker. Are we going to continue playing these huge games, these NFL games overseas, these American baseball games overseas, and start to see more fan clubs in the way that the English Premier League is seeing bars pop up here that are supporting certain teams and so on and so forth? For me, that's my marker, but I'm representing a very Eurocentric viewpoint on this panel. Dan, wrapping it up before we turn to public Q&A, same question to you. 2034 is done. Salt Lake hopefully went great. What would you see as markers of success?
So we all talk about legacy. I think that's what FIFA talks a lot about. I know like USOPC talks about legacy. So what's the US government's legacy from coast to coast in our country? You talked about resources and funding. Like I would love to see there be better focus on sports, at least organization within the US government. Are we gonna have a minister of sport in this country? Probably not. But how can we increase the infrastructure around what we currently have to better support these major events that are coming to the United States? It needs more focus. If you look back at the 1978 Amateur Sports Act signed by President Carter that set up USOC and now USOPC, came with no money. And so we're grateful for partners like USOPC that runs amateur sports in this country, but they do it with no federal funding. So how can we have a conversation at least about the possibility of there being some funding, because that gets right into youth sports, and that helps us get to 63% by 30 and makes our kids more active. And as we were talking about at the Pentagon yesterday, this is a national readiness issue. It's not just a running around a soccer field issue. So I'd love to see more funding in that area, more funding for youth sports. And to steal your point, let's keep the fun going. These are really unique opportunities that pull us together, especially as we're more divided. People are gonna come together and watch these games and have fun. And even if you can't go to a game, there's going to be events all over the country that allow Americans and citizens of the world to come together and have fun. So let's figure out what's happening in 2035.
Yes, because even though we have our 6.5 million tickets, we're anticipating 11.2 million people to come to fan festivals, which is just how do we build this excitement? Because you don't have to have a ticket to feel the World Cup impact when you're here in the US, Canada, and Mexico.
Love it.
So you heard it here. If in 2034 you have seen extra funding for youth sports, new sports being played, new sports, American sports being played abroad, and potentially a couple of additional sporting events tacking on the years of this decade, then you will have known that the foresight of this panel was indeed correct, and it has been a success. Hopefully, we will see. A lot of opportunities coming in 10 years. But also at this point, we would like to turn to see if there are any questions from the audience. I see a handful of hands raised here. Yes, you can take this one too. Thank you all for your engagement. There's 3 here. We can maybe start in the row, and then second in the middle, and then third back there.
Hi, my name is Connor Gielan. I'm a senior at Georgetown University here. My question is, I think we're all kind of talking about here, serving local fans, and I mean, if we're talking about the Men's World Cup or the upcoming Olympics, we're talking about Americans going to these events, but these are obviously global events that have visitors coming in. I know a critique of the Qatar World Cup is that there weren't a lot of international fans who traveled there. How does the planning of having thousands and thousands and thousands of fans come to the United States factor into your planning, particularly public transport, pricing, and long journeys and geography as well?
I'm happy to kick it off.
Alex?
We are planning with the assumption of about 6 million fans will be coming to the U.S. from abroad. So we are very much thinking that this is a global sport. It doesn't mean that every fan that's coming has a ticket. A lot of our fans are coming because they want to go to the Fan Fest, they want to be at the base camp city where their team is, they want to be here for the World Cup. It also doesn't hurt that US, Canada, and Mexico are locations that have lots of flights that are coming in every day, easy to get to, and we know that based on our assumptions, fans are coming and they're here to stay for a while, to see and to travel around and to tour, which is really exciting, again, for the opportunity. When it comes to planning, from our side, we talk with the federal governments, US, Canada, and Mexico on a very regular basis to say, how do we make sure that our airports are ready for a mass of fans to come? For Club World Cup, we're talking about how do we make sure that the airports are ready for 2 opposing teams arriving at the same time and being in the same customs line. But we're talking through how do we make sure that there is easy to identify ways to get to public transit, to get to locations. We recognize that sometimes you travel through an airport and it's hard to find where you need to go, and when you have so many fans coming at the same time, how do you make that flow easier? All of our host cities have host city committees who are working with their local transportation departments, with their local and state emergency managers, with all the planning that goes into large-scale events, to see what new initiatives can they do. Kansas City is a great example of really focusing on how do they use the World Cup to increase their public transit. So every city is a little unique, but in general, everyone is focused on, we have a lot of fans coming. We know we'll have a lot of fans coming. That makes it so exciting. We know Americans will also be coming from different cities. So it might be in Seattle, you're having folks from Maine, from Nebraska, from Chicago coming as well. So how do you make it easy to get to public transit? How do you make it easy to find where you need to go? How do you make arrivals easy? How do you make just the general experience as enjoyable as possible? And we're preparing too for worst case scenarios. So what happens if there is something that is making it hard to cross the Vancouver-Seattle border? Our Seattle Host City Committee is already talking with neighboring cities to say, do you have housing available if there's an issue and we need to house fans? So we're taking a look both at the opportunity, but also at the more risk assessment. What else do we need to make sure? Because for a lot of fans who are coming, this may be their first time to the US or Canada or Mexico. So we want to make sure that they have a good time and come back, but also that they are safe, secure, that this is the most safe and secure World Cup, and that there's no issues that are popping up. So we work with the federal governments, we're working with our host state committees, we're working with state and local, and then of course there's the diplomatic piece too. We're going to be working with all the embassies, US embassies abroad, Canadian embassies abroad, Mexican embassies abroad, state, et cetera, to make sure that they are also amplifying the right messaging. Making sure that if someone's coming to the country, they know how to call local police if they have an issue. Because a lot of fans aren't going to know that. That they know, you can't bring drones into the country. That they know basic information that will make it so that they don't have issues once they're here.
Can I just add on, one, you mentioned Seattle a couple times. I was in Seattle last week with the host committee, and at the airport, walking through what the fan experience will be, they have left no stone unturned. If someone needs to get off the plane and they're coming for the World Cup and they have a pet with them, they have thought about signage for that in multiple languages based on who might be playing in that game. So it kind of blew my mind where they're at this point. So kudos to Seattle, but I know it's happening across the country. But it all comes back to comms, and speaking from the State Department up here, we're looking forward to diplomatic briefings in early 2025. We're going to over-communicate to the point where we schedule a meeting and no one shows up. That's the goal. So just heavy communication, and you're going to be a part of that.
Another sign of success if nobody's showing up to Dan's meetings. We had one here and then one down the middle of the aisle, I believe, just in the back, sir, in the blue shirt.
Hi, my name is Patrick Rankin. I'm a senior at Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Maryland. My question is, how can cities that do not host international sports regularly, for example, I'm from San Antonio, Texas, and we do not host international sports that well, how can those cities improve their case to host international sporting events like the World Athletic Championships and possibly a host city for the World Cup or the Olympics and Paralympics?
Well, I can jump in and say San Antonio is actually one of our options for base camp cities for when a national team's coming in to select that city as a location. I think in general for how cities can prepare, it's pieces that a lot of cities are already focused on. It's how do you make sure that you have transit that would work for a large influx of visitors to come. It's how do you make sure that you have safety and security apparatus and plans, because this is what international organizing bodies are looking for. How do you make sure that you have the engagement already set with business community, with local leaders, with community leaders, so that an organizing body doesn't want to go to a city where the fans don't want that event. And then, at the end of the day, for both, and I'm speaking for Olympics here at the moment, but for World Cup especially, it is a tournament. It is soccer. So how do you make sure you have the right pitches and the right facilities? So that, I think, from our lenses, as we're looking at base camp cities, what we're keeping in mind.
And if I can add on, I talked about the Tourism Policy Committee subcommittee on sports. Like, our first thing that we're coming up with is a playbook for cities across the country. So if you want to host, you don't look around and wonder who to talk to. You're going to either have our playbook or you're going to know where to get it from. And it's going to have all the answers, or at least a contact at the bottom with someone who's going to answer your phone, pick up the phone if you have an immigration question, a sanctions question, whatever it might be for the U.S. government, or broadly, how do I host? How do I attract an international event? Ideally, this book is going to help, be your roadmap.
You said you're from San Antonio? Yes. Okay, Tim Duncan, right? Athlete voices have never been louder. So if you can have a champion, an athlete like a Tim Duncan, a Greg Popovich, a Wemby, right? We're talking cross borders then. I think that would speak volumes, just if you have the backing of someone with that loud of a platform and that loud of a voice. For a city like San Antonio, I think that could move mountains.
Spurs are playing in Paris in an NBA game, I believe, in January, so we're starting to see these growth progressions continue. We had one right down the middle of the aisle, sir, in the glasses.
Good afternoon, Danny Navarro. You probably might know me as travel football fan from social media. I have a community of almost 50,000 followers who are planning and how to save money and travel the upcoming World Cup. And so on this topic of tickets, it's really good that you've mentioned 6.5 million tickets are going to be available. I hope I can go ahead and tweet that out right now. But more importantly, and not to hold FIFA's feet to the fire, but I think more importantly, how can we communicate better to fans that this is a whole totally different ticketing process, because we're very much used to the third-party resale markets here in the U.S. I've been telling fans, hey, from my experience going to Qatar World Cup, you might need a passport. It's only through FIFA. How is FIFA planning to, on one end, fend off the third-party resale sites, on one end, communicate to fans that it's actually FIFA selling the tickets, and then how can we ensure that scams and frauds don't happen? Because the last thing I want to have my followers, and just as a personal story, I don't want fans to have their World Cup dreams be shattered because A, they spent $3,000, $4,000, $10,000 for a fake ticket. Thank you.
I'll touch on, so Paris just did it. Paris, over 300 million impressions on their app and their website. So everything, again, was digital. So the third-party resale site, yeah, there were maybe some, attempts at it, but the local they had it down, and that was in partnership with the French local authorities and the Paris government. And from a user perspective, having received tickets that way, it was pretty seamless. So I'm sure FIFA is learning from that.
Yes, we learn every World Cup and we learn every Olympic cycle. One, I like your posts often, so thank you for what you're doing to share with fans. No, there is a big communications piece, as Dan was saying, and you probably saw recently some third-party tickets have popped up, and FIFA was very vocal in saying, do not buy from third party, that will be through our sites. As ticketing is popping up and as we're getting more and more folks to register for tickets, we're doing a push, one through embassies, but a lot through our sponsors and partners in media. We have the draw coming up in December, which is going to be a big push for us to remind everyone that there is only one location to get tickets. I I think the other piece that's really important is, because we also know that sometimes scam sites pop up on the visa side as well. So what we're making sure is that on our FIFA site and on the World Cup site and Club World Cup site, not only is that where you're going for ticketing, but it's going to have a resource for what visa do you need, how do you get a visa, where do you need to go, that then directs back to the government site. So if you're going on and you're saying, I'm coming from France and I'm going to Canada and Mexico, it's going to show you what visas you need to apply for, and it's going to direct you to the government site. Because we do know that sometimes sites pop up pretending to be the government site. We don't want that. So there's going to be sites on our side. There's going to be a lot of social media amplification, a lot of press pushes around this once that fan site goes live. And then with everything involved with ticketing, it's going to remind fans, you need a visa. You need a passport, because I think folks do sometimes forget that the ticket doesn't guarantee you entry in any of the 3 countries. You need a visa, you need a passport as well, or visa waiver program. So any message that comes out about ticketing will also have with it visa information as well, and some know before you go reminders, because we also don't want fans to think that, oh, this site that I saw got me a ticket and it told me I don't need a visa, and then they show up and they can't get on the plane and they can't come. So that's a big focus for us, to make sure that the fan experience is enjoyable, and that starts before they even come to the US. But we will be talking with you and other influencers, but also especially with media, and once our public-facing site is live.
And if you have specific questions for any of our 3 panelists, we will be mingling around throughout the rest of this day. I have been told that it is time for us to cut this panel because we are moving on with this program. That being said, I saw a handful more hands up there. Please feel free to come stop any of us to chat, make sure that we connect, because you also are going to be very imperative in making this global decade of mega sporting events that success that we talked about. On behalf of my 3 panelists, we'd like to say thanks to Jetr Global and the Embassy of Spain, Spanish Cultural Center, the building that we're currently in as well, for assembling this day, and I look forward to connecting with all of you throughout the rest of the afternoon. Thanks, team.